Undeclared wars are commonplace. Tragically, our government engages in preemptive war, otherwise known as aggression, with no complaints from the American people. Sadly, we have become accustomed to living with the illegitimate use of force by government. To develop a truly free society, the issue of initiating force must be understood and rejected.
What if sometimes, to love your country, you had to alter or abolish the government? What if Jefferson was right? What if that government is best which governs least? What if it is dangerous to be right when the government is wrong? What if it is better to perish fighting for freedom than to live as a slave? What if freedom's greatest hour of danger is now?
Hi, everyone. Judge Andrew Napolitano here for Judging Freedom. Today is Wednesday, January 28th, 2026. Professor Glenn Diesen joins us now. Professor Diesen, a pleasure, my dear friend, and thank you for accommodating my schedule as you always do. Before we get to Davos and President Trump and Vladimir Zelenskyy and the EU, I want to ask you about Minnesota. Is there a noticeable interest in or reaction from Europeans over these killings in the streets of Minneapolis, Minnesota by federal agents?
No, it does appear in the media, of course, and it's seen in the context of the concern overall with the United States, what direction it's headed, because all of this, different rights and the limitations on state power, which to a large extent has defined the United States, is all seen to be thrown away. And there's also some commentary on the principles which are actually followed, because from the Republican side, we always remember that whenever there's a protest, that is when they say the far left protested, and anyone holds up a gun, be it Kyle Rittenhouse, I think his name was, or others, it's celebrated as standing up for the Second Amendment. And but now, of course, it's those principles don't seem to apply once there's someone on the other side who is suspected of carrying a weapon. But overall, it fits it within the wider concern of the direction the U.S. is currently taking.
I would imagine the concept of a civilian carrying a weapon at a political demonstration is alien to most Europeans, but of course it's very commonplace here in the U.S. As you know, the scholar that you are, the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled that the Second Amendment, which guarantees the right to keep and bear arms, is as potent and forceful as the First Amendment, meaning these guys that took these federal cops that took his weapon away from him did so unlawfully. They couldn't take his weapon away from him because he had it legally, any more than they could silence him from criticizing them. The poor guy reacted to an ICE agent pushing a woman, to the ground. He pushed her to the ground because she blew a whistle at him, and she videoed him with her iPhone. And then after she was pushed to the ground, this young man went to help her, and then he was pushed to the ground, and then they sprayed pepper spray in his eyes, and then they shot him in the back 9 times. You can see him being shot right there. This is simply reprehensible. This is government at its absolute worst, and it defies what you just articulated so nicely. The concept of limited government in America absolutely defies it. Just like killing those boat people on the Caribbean by the military defies it. Do Europeans see a line there? Do they see Trump as encouraging violence or as just being a forceful enforcer of the law?
No, it's definitely not seeing him as an enforcer of the law. But it's a good point what you mentioned about the weapon laws, because for the Europeans, when they observe this, they don't see any justified reason why anyone should be allowed to carry a weapon, essentially, at the protest. So, but this is also a cultural thing that the Europeans they have very strict gun laws all across the continent. So, so to some extent, it is judged along those lines. But I think the overarching picture is this concern about what's happening to the United States. I do think that they limit themselves to a little bit of Trump, that everything is about Trump. And indeed, a lot is about Trump. But it's also growing disorder. And again, a lot of this political polarization, which has been brewing for a long time, the economic inequalities, the bit of tearing up the social fabric, the decline of these principles, which the Americans seem to hold very dearly. A lot of this has been brewing for quite some time. So I think it's better to look at Trump more of a symptom of the direction of society as opposed to the one who's doing everything himself.
Was there consensus among the EU leadership about Trump's speech at Davos? It was rather not flattering of the Europeans.
No, there's a growing frustration, and it's almost impressive how he has alienated the Europeans, because the European leaders can't really imagine a world where the West isn't led by the United States. Nonetheless, you do see some of the Europeans still bowing to Trump. That is, after he spent a lot of time criticizing and almost mocking the Europeans, the European leaders, to be more specific. You saw people like the former Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte, who's now the NATO Secretary General, just spending interview after interview praising the genius that is Trump. That essentially the argument he's making is, us Europeans would never have spent this money on the military. The only way you can get us to do anything is to twist our arms, and that's what Trump is doing. This is why he's so great, which is a very strange way of looking at politics.
Vladimir Zelenskyy gave a speech at Davos in which he called the EU leaders lost and subservient to the US. I can't imagine that went over very well.
No, but it probably hits a sore spot because they are weak and that they are subservient.
Right, it hit a sore spot because it's true.
But it is a good point that this is something, if you follow the German media, that didn't go down well, that that a country that's been aiding them, allegedly supporting Ukraine, he should treat them with a bit more respect. And there's a growing pushback in Germany as well against Zelenskyy. Keep in mind that the largest political party there now, AfD, that is in the polls, are growing very angry with the Ukraine. They want the Ukraine to now to reimburse and rebuild the Nord Stream, which they attacked, and they want the billions they sent back as well. But regarding Zelenskyy's speech, he insulted the Europeans, he mocked them, and in return he got a standing ovations from those same Europeans. So it is a remarkable thing to watch. But for many of the European leaders, he still carries with him this whole reputation of being the second coming of Winston Churchill. So he's the one standing up to Russia. He's fighting our fight. So it's very hard. Well, the Europeans are prepared to take a lot of punishment, I think.
Well, what are the Europeans prepared to do to help him bring about an end to the war? They can't help him win the war. I mean, that would be, I would think, impossible at this point.
No, I don't think they're going to help him end the war. I think if you listen to many of the European leaders, their objective is to help Ukraine lose the war slower, but in the process, losing more men, more territory, and more of the infrastructure. I think the original recipe we saw for the war 4 years ago, it was outlined by Zelenskyy, by the way, in March of 2022. He gave an interview to The Economist. He made it clear that many Western leaders, in terms of seeking peace with Russia, he said they want a long war, because in a long war they will have the opportunity to bleed out or weaken the Russians, even if it means the destruction of Ukraine. So I think not that much has changed. No one is willing to concede that the Russians have won. So the main objective, I don't think winning is realistic anymore, but it hasn't been either for a very long time. But I think the main objective now is simply make Ukraine lose a little bit slower, buy some time for the Europeans, and hopefully weaken Russia a little bit more in the process.
Our colleague who comes to us from Brussels, Gilbert Doctorow, says that there are two lines of negotiation going on simultaneously in Abu Dhabi. One is between senior military officials, not uniformed generals, but civilians who run the Russian military and the Ukrainian military. They're actually sitting down in the same room with each other, according to Gilbert. And they are negotiating the logistics of the removal of Ukrainian military from the areas in which they're fighting. Now, if that's going on, then they're going to surrender the territory, notwithstanding Zelenskyy. I want to say President Zelenskyy, and of course, he's no longer the president. Vladimir Zelensky's statement also made at Davos that we won't surrender an inch of land. I mean, a statement like that must have been made for domestic Ukrainian consumption, because if he's serious, the Russians will go home. They won't negotiate.
No, definitely. If this is serious, then there's no peace that can be had. But that being said, he's been, well, I guess very difficult from the get-go. But I'm still a little bit optimistic that a peace could be possible, simply for the reason that it's quite obvious now that things will only go from bad to worse. And in terms of how Zelenskyy was scolding the Europeans, this is an interesting context, because as the US is seeking to hand over responsibility to the Europeans, and the Europeans are not up for the task, it's quite interesting to see that you have to see the scolding of the Europeans in the context of the massive manpower losses on the front line, in terms of the weakening position of the economy, how the infrastructure, especially the electric infrastructure, are being destroyed. So given this, I do think that there's a growing appetite in Ukraine for a settlement, and you hear this from more leading voices in Ukraine as well, that the Europeans do not really have a plan for Ukraine. All they want to do is drag the fight out a little bit longer, just make the Ukrainians fight just a little bit more, than maybe something can happen. But they know that they're being pulled along. So this is, I think, more and more recognizing this is the end of the line. So it wouldn't surprise me if there's now a willingness to give up Donetsk, because they're losing it anyways. It's either through negotiations or on the battlefield. And even if you don't care about all the lives being lost, if they lose it on the battlefield, it's going to take many more months. And during those months, the Russians will also take territory in Zaporizhzhia. They will take it in Sumy. They will take it in Kharkov. So there will be a lot of more territorial losses as well. So it's a good chance that this is the case. But again, Zelenskyy has to deal with domestic opposition, the nationalist. He has to deal with his foreign partners. So it could simply be managing the domestic audience as well, while he's trying to see what they can get in any peaceful settlement.
Would President Putin and the Kremlin allow the Europeans to seize the 300 billion in Brussels and other European banks of Russian state funds if it were used directly for what Zelenskyy would call reparations, what the Russians would call repair of infrastructure in Ukraine?
No, definitely not as reparations, because the way Russia sees this is that it was NATO that triggered the war. It was Ukraine's attacks on Donbass which compelled Russia to intervene. So this is the Russian perspective. So it's not just that it would be a massive loss of money, but the Russian government would then have to explain itself to its citizens why it would agree to such a thing. Now, if there is, I think it's possible that there would be some agreements in terms of some reconstruction, but I think the Russian money would then be used to rebuild what is now on the Russian side of the front line. So it's very hard to see the Russians handing over money to Ukraine. It doesn't make any sense. This is it falls within the European playbook. That is, we drag out the war as long as possible. Once the war has been lost, we set our demands, which is NATO membership, European troops in Ukraine, 800,000 man strong army, and of course Russia has to pay for everything. It's fantasy land.
That's a pipe dream.
Yes, very much so. But everything is the media coverage, the way the politicians talk. It's all wishful thinking. There's nothing here which is tied to reality, to how the situation is actually developing on the ground.
The other line of negotiation of which Gilbert Doctorow speaks is between Witkoff and Kushner, and I forget the other fellow's name, the guy that went to Stanford, who's the financial guy that advises President Putin, who's been negotiating with them for a long time. And this is over the normalization of U.S.-Russian relations. This, I guess, assumes that the war will end, and they're negotiating what I guess would be a step-by-step removal of sanctions, a return of a commercial, academic, cultural, travel, you name it, normalcy between the Russian Federation and the United States. Do you understand this is being negotiated as well at the same time, but in a dual track, one to end the military, special military operation, the other to reunite or to return U.S. and Russia to normalcy?
No, and I think this has been a key objective. Marco Rubio spoke about this many months ago, that this was a key objective to normalize relations between the U.S. and Russia, and this would require reopening consulates and the likes. But it's proven to be very difficult to normalize bilateral ties as long as the Ukraine war hangs over them. But even that being said, I think it's a good format to have the Russians, Americans, and the Ukrainians there. I know that Trump positions the U.S. role as a mediator, trying to bring the two parties together. But at the same time, Trump and Rubio has both also admitted that this is a proxy war. So this has been primarily a war between NATO and Russia, which means the U.S. and Russia, using Ukraine as a pawn. So this is why the war is so complex. It has to be solved, both the U.S., both the NATO-Russia ties, as well as the Ukraine and Russia. So it's good to be able to run these things parallel. I think behind the scenes of the U.S. playing the role as a mediator, I do think that there's some real discussions being made in terms of how to resolve the overall differences, because the reason why we have a proxy war is we have a broken European security architecture, and I think these are some of the underlying causes, as the Russians keep referring to it, for the war, which they want to have resolved. So,
I'm sorry. Please continue. My apologies.
No, I was just saying to resolve this, the United States is the main actor they have to talk to.
Right. Well, the United States was the main actor in the CIA's effort to kill President Putin by bombing his house. Has the Kremlin forgotten that?
No, not at all. But this is also why it's a bit silly to only look at negotiations as being a Russian-Ukrainian thing. I always point out that it was the United States that took the lead in toppling Yanukovych back in 2014.
Right.
It was the CIA that established, that pushed into Ukraine on the first day after the coup. It's been the U.S. who trained the Azov battalions and the nationalists. It was the U.S., according to the general prosecutor of Ukraine, that dictated who could be in the Ukrainian government and who had to stay out. It's the U.S. that financed civil society, NGOs, and the media. And overall, it's the U.S. that has been running Ukraine as a fiefdom or as a colony. And it's in this war as well, where the war planning comes from American generals in Ukraine. It's American weapons. The targeting is from American intelligence. Sometimes American contractors pull the trigger. So this is very much still a U.S. and NATO war. So it's very to only talk about how Ukraine and Russia can resolve their differences, it doesn't make much sense. So I'm assuming that a large part of the talk is how to improve relations between the United States and Russia as well.
What will happen if the United States withdraws from NATO? An interesting long editorial in today's. I know you read this as I do. I wish more people read this paper, the Financial Times, but whatever. Long think piece in there about how the Europeans are terrified and not yet prepared for what might be an American departure from NATO, given the Russophobia that pervades. I don't know if it pervades Norway and Sweden. It certainly seems to pervade Germany, France, and Great Britain. What will happen if the U.S. withdraws from NATO?
Well, I think, many things. First are the Europeans will begin to fragment, I assume, because the United States always played a role as the pacifier in Europe. And I think you can expect them to see the Europeans beginning to fragment, divide, turn on each other. And you're already seeing this to some extent, by the way. But I think it could also be an opportunity. Keep in mind that when the Cold War came to an end, when it was announced over in 1989, there was a lot of efforts and the desire in Europe to create some kind of inclusive security architecture in Europe based on indivisible security. So no one enhances its security at the expense of others. This would be inclusive. This would then include the Soviets and then later, the Russians. But as was discovered, it didn't really accommodate the US in Europe if in the same way if Russia was accommodated. So for this reason, the Europeans decided to back the US push to instead expand NATO, which was a hegemonic formula for developing European security. They knew this would cause conflicts with the Russians after some time, but this is the price we paid to have America in Europe. So my perspective is that if America no longer wants to be in Europe, at least to the same extent, there is an opportunity to at least end these dividing lines in Europe and essentially return to this principle of indivisible security instead of having security based solely on deterrence, which is enforced through these military blocks.
How fractured is the EU?
Well, how can you have 27 member countries agreeing on policies which tends to undermine their interest, that cut themselves off from key trading partners, prevents diversification? It's not very sustainable. And you already seen some divisions. That is, France didn't want to buy British weapons or missiles to send to Ukraine because they feel instead they should buy European weapons. That is EU, and Britain left. We see growing rift between France and Germany. This partnership, which was supposed to be at the core of the European Union, is also a bit tense. You've seen some tensions between the German Chancellor Merz and von der Leyen in the EU. You see, even within the EU, you have tensions between von der Leyen and Callas. A recent Politico article wrote that Callas had referred to von der Leyen as a dictator, that she was trying to hold on to all power on her own. Again, these people are not letting any crisis go to waste, and there's a power grab, and sometimes they go after each other. And of course, you have the traditional ones, that is Hungary versus Germany, or even the European Union itself. There's concerns in Budapest now that the EU is backing essentially what they see as an effort to have a regime change in Hungary during their next election, some kind of a new color revolution. So overall, there's a lot of distrust, and there's not a lot of, especially this point in time. How do you adjust to a multipolar world? How are you going to have 27 heads of states or 27 countries agreeing on the same approach? How do you deal with the United States? Do you bow to Trump during this time, hope that you will be spared, or do you diversify, link yourself to other countries, be it China or others? I mean, it's very difficult to find a consensus around these things. In the past, if we're going to have a consensus, it was imposed by the United States. So I would expect a lot fragmentation coming our way.
Wow. Fascinating observations, Professor Diesen. Fascinating. Thank you very much for them. We'll look forward to seeing you. But your explanations are brilliant and very enlightening, and we don't see that much of explanations like this in the Western press. Thank you very much. Very enjoyable, very informative. We'll look forward to seeing you next week.
Great. That's a pleasure as always, Judge.
Thank you. All the best. Coming up at 3 o'clock this afternoon on all of this, including a classic confrontation between Senator Rand Paul and Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Phil Giraldi, Judge Napolitano for Judging Freedom.